Hollywood loves a good crime movie, and like many of the other film genres that are drawn from real-life history and iconography, it's only natural that that very reality has collided with the art form in a variety of different and sometimes unexpected ways. Just like the oldest westerns had actual Old West cowboys and lawmen consulting on them or even starring in them, or like war movies have featured many actors who served their countries in wartime, so too have mob pictures featured actors who either rubbed shoulders of real-life mobsters, were a part of a criminal organization themselves before they got into acting, or worked against them on the opposite side of the war. I'm Ewan, this is What Culture, and here are 10 mob movie actors who were actually there. Number 10. Robert De Niro. One of the greatest actors of his generation, Robert De Niro announced himself as a truly inimitable screen presence with the first of many collaborations with filmmaker Martin Scorsese, 1973's Mean Streets. Scorsese's rich and violent tapestry of New York street life drew upon his own experiences growing up in Little Italy, an authenticity that was duly reflected on the screen and aided by the casting of fellow New Yorkers who grew up in and around street crime as Scorsese did. One such actor was Robert De Niro, who portrayed John Chiavello opposite Harvey Keitel's Charlie Capper. De Niro, who was known to Scorsese before he started acting, immortalized himself instantly with the part. Just as Scorsese had drawn upon his own childhood growing up in Manhattan when crafting Mean Streets, so too, seemingly, had De Niro. In a discussion with Vanity Fair published in 2014, Scorsese recounted the meeting that would lead to De Niro being cast in Mean Streets, recalling how he had recognized his would-be longtime collaborator from his days hanging around the Ken Mare gang on Hester Street. By the time Scorsese and De Niro had their reunion, it had been 14 years since they passed each other by on Hester Street, by which point both had established themselves in the film industry and were poised to ignite a partnership that would define a decade of cinema. Number 9. Alex Rocco. The history behind the making of The Godfather is arguably just as fascinating as the film itself, enough that its production inspired a somewhat middling dramatization on Paramount Plus in 2023 called The Offer. The production of The Godfather drew heavy interest from the mob through the Italian-American Civil Rights League, which was the political arm of the Colombo crime family. Then current and former members of the Mafia had a hand in multiple aspects of Francis Ford Coppola's film, whether that was Mario Puzo's script being adjusted to remove direct mentions of the word Mafia and Cosa Nostra, or even the castings themselves. Now, to be clear, Alex Rocco was not one of those Mafia-influenced castings, but the actor, born Alessandro Federico Petricone Jr., and who played Las Vegas heavyweight Mo Green in Coppola's picture, did have a criminal past, racking up multiple arrests in his native Massachusetts and drawing allegations for associating with the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American crime syndicate which operated out of Boston. It was alleged that Rocco was the getaway driver in the assassination of Bernie McLaughlin, a heavy in the rival Charlestown mob who was gunned down in 1961, although the case against him was dismissed due to a lack of evidence. After spending time in prison on a different charge, Rocco swapped Boston for the Golden State and started his acting career, which remained active until his death in 2015. Green was almost certainly his most iconic role though, with the character's death in Coppola's masterful baptism sequence a genre-defining image. Number 8. George Raft. While the definitive image of the mob and crime movie today has been largely painted by the American New Wave of the 1970s, more specifically in the films of Scorsese, Coppola, and Brian De Palma, that doesn't make the genre's formative works from the 1930s and 40s any less iconic. The likes of Howard Hawks' Scarface, Raoul Walsh's White Heat, and William Wellman's Pre-Code The Public Enemy are just 3 of the many mob films from the era that exacted a heady influence on the genre and medium more generally, taking direct inspiration from the stories of contemporary criminals like John Dillinger, Al Capone, and Babyface Nelson, and enshrining the gangster in modern mythology. Much like their new Hollywood descendants, these films were closely entwined with the history of the day. The Great Depression saw plenty of infamous criminals attain folk hero or celebrity status, the aforementioned trio among them, and then post-war with the likes of Mickey Cohen and Cohen's bodyguard, Johnny Stompanato, who were both figures of the Los Angeles nightlife and naturally interacted with many Hollywood figures of the day. And for Stompanato, it would actually lead to his death. One such actor who controversially crossed paths with Cohen and the mob was George Raft, a genre star who started his performing career as a dancer in New York City before coming to Hollywood in the late 1920s. Raft starred in a number of gangster pictures, but none more famous than Scarface and Some Like It Hot, the former a biographical picture inspired by the rise of Al Capone, and the latter a legendary Billy Wilder-directed romantic comedy about two musicians who witnessed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and disguised themselves as women to avoid reprisals from the Chicago outfit. Raft, who acquitted himself brilliantly in both of those roles, is said to have pursued his Hollywood career on the advice of Oni the Killer Madden, a mob figure who Raft also chauffeured back in his heyday. He maintained these mob connections during his Hollywood peak, allegedly intervening to stop a hit placed on the then Screen Actors Guild president James Cagney, who was actively combating mafia activity in the industry. Raft's ties to the mob ran incredibly deep, being personally involved with the likes of Cohen, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, who was actually a childhood friend. Talk about connections. Number 7. Giani Russo. Back to The Godfather again, and Alex Rocco was far from the only actor with mob connections who took a starring role in that film. Giani Russo, who portrayed abusive husband Carlo Rizzi in The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, also boasted some serious ties to organized crime. Russo grew up in Staten Island and did work for Frank Costello of the Luciano family, before he began acting in the 1970s, with The Godfather marking his full film debut. However, his casting in that film did not mark a break from his mob ties. As detailed in Vanity Fair's The Godfather Wars, Russo is said to have been cast in the film at the insistence of Joe Colombo. The actor's previous movements to get the part had fallen on deaf ears, but after using his connections so that the production could get access to a Staten Island location, his fortunes began to change. A read was organized, and Russo walked away with the part of Carlo. Arguably more fascinating than Russo's pre-Godfather travels, though, is what came after. As the actor recounted in his autobiography, Hollywood Godfather, years following his break into Hollywood, he found himself on the hit list of one Pablo Escobar. Yeah. You see, Russo had shot and killed a Colombian national in his Las Vegas club while defending a female patron from being harassed. Russo took a champagne bottle to the face and responded by firing 2 shots at the perpetrator's head from his own handgun. The killing itself was ruled as a justifiable homicide, but the deceased party was a member of the Medellin cartel, which led to Russo drawing attention from Escobar. In a twist that gives new meaning to the phrase stranger than fiction, though, Escobar called the hit off. He had discovered that the man who killed his associate was actually a star in The Godfather, a beloved film of his, and the contract was rescinded. Holy hell. Number 6. Tony Darrow. Tony Darrow, the stage name of Anthony Borghese, is most famous for his appearances in Goodfellas and The Sopranos. The former saw the former nightclub singer cast in the role of Sonny Buns, the owner of the Bamboo Lounge who gets bullied by Joe Pesci's Tommy, while in the latter he portrayed the Mio Capo Larry Barresi. Darrow became something of a fixture in the mob genre following his appearance in Goodfellas, taking further genre assignments in crime comedies Analyze This and Mickey Blue Eyes. But the mob was more than just a fiction for Darrow, who is known to have associated with Lucchese heavyweight Paul Vario before his acting career took off. Vario, who was actually the inspiration for the character of Paul Cicero in Goodfellas, who was played by fellow Paul Sorvino, is said to have booked Darrow for his first singing gig at the actual real-life Bamboo Lounge, with his casting in Goodfellas coming as a frankly ridiculous full-circle moment. Darrow has also previously discussed growing up around John Gotti, but his mob ties did not cease when he made the switch to acting. Described as a quote-unquote Gambino associate in real life by the New York Post in 2011, Darrow was sentenced to 6 months house arrest and 2 years probation that very year for his involvement in sanctioning the beating of a man who owed debts to a loan shark. Number 5. James Caan. James Caan is maybe the coolest actor to have ever lived. Boasting a rugged masculinity that provided an indelible mark on whichever production he ventured, Caan's most definitive turns came arguably in The Godfather, where he portrayed the hot-headed Sonny Corleone, and Thief, Michael Mann's masterful neo-noir debut that saw the actor cast in the role of a criminal yearning for a normal existence that remains painfully out of reach. Caan sadly passed away in 2022 at the age of 82, and he was speculated for years to have had mob connections. The actor is said to have modeled his performance as Sonny on Andrew "Mush" Russo, a member of the Colombo family who Caan knew of in New York, and who later became godfather to Caan's son Scott. Numerous accounts of The Godfather's production also state that Caan hung around with Carmine the Snake Persico, who frequented the set of the film while being surveilled by the FBI, enough that Caan was reportedly mistaken by the law enforcement agency as an actual Colombo associate. Stories of Caan's mob associations only get wilder from there. As per his obituary in The Guardian, one of the most infamous examples of the actor's criminal links occurred in the 1990s, when he and his close friend Anthony Fiato, who was a notorious hitman for the Los Angeles crime family, arranged a meeting with the kidnappers of Caan's brother Ronnie, initially under the guise of paying a ransom. Instead, Caan, Fiato, and a number of their associates arrived armed with, quote, guns and baseball bats. Even more strange than that, though, is that Caan was also accused of arranging for Joe Pesci to be assaulted over an unpaid $8,000 tab the actor ostensibly racked up at the Miami hotel of one of Caan's friends. Clearly, that hard-as-nails persona was anything but for show. Number 4. Dennis Farina. A fellow Thief alumnus, Dennis Farina was one of the true great crime genre fixtures of the 80s and 90s, making his debut in Mann's movie before starring in films like Code of Silence, Manhunter, Midnight Run, and Out of Sight. The subject matter of these films wasn't far removed from Farina's pre-acting career either, as the actor served in the Chicago Police Department all the way up to his work on Code of Silence, which he completed between shifts as a detective. Farina had initially signed on to Thief as one of the film's police consultants, but Mann ended up giving him a minor role as a mob gunman who gets taken out in the movie's blisteringly good finale. Seriously, that's one of my favorite movie scenes of all time. The bit where Caan reloads his Colt 45. Oh my god, just hook it to my veins. Now, Farina's impact in Thief is quite minimal, but his striking facial features, including that iconic tash, made him a perfect fit for the big screen. Mann would reunite with Farina on several productions, including the aforementioned Manhunter, where he played FBI Director Jack Crawford, and on Miami Vice, where he made sporadic appearances as mobster Albert Lombard. Mann's commitment to authenticity remains one of his best traits as a filmmaker, and we're all the more lucky that it brought someone like Farina, who sadly died at the age of 69 in 2013, into the spotlight for as long as it did. Number 3. Chuck Adamson. Like Dennis Farina, film audiences were first introduced to former Chicago cop Chuck Adamson in Michael Mann's Thief, in which he played a crooked cop looking to extort James Caan's Frank to get a cut of the profits from his next score. Now, Adamson is a pivotal figure in Mann's film history, more than just this one scene would intimate, as his time on the force directly inspired the premise of the filmmaker's magnum opus, Heat. Adamson only had a few minor screen roles over the course of his film and TV career, primarily working instead as a technical advisor and screenwriter, but his presence undoubtedly had a huge impact on Mann's early work, the success of which drew from a seamless blend of style, emotion, and veracity. If Khan and Tangerine Dream brought the vibes, then Adamson and Man's Curiosity brought the truth, kicking off a decade-spanning career for the latter, and in the process cementing himself as one of the true great American filmmakers of the 20th century. Beyond his friendship and collaborations with Mann as an advisor, Adamson also co-created the TV series Crime Story, which featured Farina in the leading role of Chicago detective Lieutenant Mike Torello. Also, fun fact, Adamson's co-creator on the show, Gustav Reininger, even went undercover to meet underworld figures when developing the series. Oh my god. Number 2. Tony Sirico. Best known as Paulie Walnuts in David Chase's seminal HBO classic The Sopranos, Tony Sirico had been busy cutting his cloth as a minor supporting player in dozens of pictures since the early 1970s, even appearing in a small, uncredited capacity in 1974's The Godfather Part 2. Sirico made his screen debut as an extra that same year in Crazy Joe, and quickly established himself as a regular in crime movies. Again, though, the subject matter of these projects wouldn't have felt too distant for Sirico, who, before beginning his career as an actor, was arrested on 28 separate occasions and had a, quote, reputation as a stick-up artist in his childhood neighborhood of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Sirico had 2 stretches in prison, one for illegal possession of a firearm, the other for armed robbery, and it was during one of these stints that his interest in acting actually began. As per a 1990 profile in the Los Angeles Times, Sirico was bitten by the acting bug after seeing a performance from ex-convict actors. In his own words, quote, "I watched them and thought, I can do that," explaining that the skills he'd gained surviving on the street and in prison had already made him well accustomed to theatrics. Sirico made a name for himself as a bit player in the mob genre, notably featuring in Goodfellas, Copland, and Mickey Blue Eyes across the 1990s, but found his greatest mob role on TV as Paulie Galtieri in The Sopranos. A fan favorite in every sense of the word, Sirico was an essential part of the genre's scenery for several decades, and there's no doubt his time on the streets made a huge contribution to that. And number 1, Lenny Montana. The cast of The Godfather was stacked with name actors, as well as those who, while lacking in stature at the time, made impressive contributions in minor or supporting roles. Possibly the best from the latter category in terms of on-screen memorability and impact is Lenny Montana, who portrayed the nervous giant/mob enforcer of Don Vito Corleone, Luca Brasi. Brasi's time in The Godfather is only brief, showing up at the very beginning of Coppola's film to pay his respects to Vito, while Michael informs Kay of the hitman's reputation, only to be then taken out in a hit as he tries to infiltrate Sollozzo's operation. Luca Brasi Sleeps with the Fishes canonized the character as a genre icon, even while Montana himself pursued scarcely few assignments in the years following The Godfather's release in theaters. It's perhaps no surprise that Montana acquitted himself so well in the role. The anxious yet all too deadly Brasi was cut from a similar cloth. Before he started acting, Montana worked as an enforcer for the Colombo crime family, following years spent as a prolific professional wrestler. As detailed in that previously mentioned Vanity Fair long read, Montana came to set one day and instantly caught Coppola's eye. Gray Frederickson, a producer on the film, recounted how Montana would explain his various mob activities to the cast and crew, going so far as to discuss his arson strategies. Quote, "He'd tie tampons in the tail of a mouse, dip it in kerosene, light it, and let the mouse run through a building." That's just one example he gives in that article. The rest of it is just as wild. Although Montana was a titan of the ring, and the arson scene too, evidently, he was understandably less confident about appearing in an acting role. That nervousness that Brasi displays when he rehearses his speech to Vito was genuine for Montana, who was desperately trying to master his lines before sharing the screen with Brando. The end result gave us arguably the most authentic moments of Coppola's entire trilogy, with Montana conveying threat and vulnerability in a way only someone like he could.